Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we're here for my LCK Week 5 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. I am, if you notice, a little bit sick still. I haven't gotten entirely over the cold that I kind of showed off yesterday in the LPL video, so I'm sorry if my voice is still a little bit hoarse, but hopefully the analysis is good. I am feeling a bit better today, so this video should be at least slightly more energetic than what I was able to get out yesterday when it came to the LPL, but outside of that, it was a really fun week in the LCK. The LCK is really interesting right now. I think there are a lot of teams that are kind of really performing well, but we're all kind of waiting for the shoe to drop on some of them. Maybe some teams that aren't performing up to expectations that we're maybe hoping can kind of turn it around as the year goes on. We're really going to see if patterns are going to stick or if they are going to be changed, and we're going to find out a lot of that here in week number 5. If you are excited for the video, let me know down in the comment section below. What series were you most looking forward to? You know I love hearing from you guys. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go through all 5 days of LCK action, going over all 10 series, talking about my player of the series, my dud of the series, where teams are going right, where teams are going wrong, and then at the end, I will be updating you guys on my weekly power rankings. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the video, and we kicked off our LCK Week 5 coverage with a pretty fun series on day number 1 here. We had KT Rolster taking on DRX. Now, this is supposed to be a much more interesting series than it actually is, but KT Rolster blows them out of the water, and I would argue that this is honestly surprising, if only because it's KT Rolster coming off of a week where they genuinely looked like one of the best teams in the entire world. For them to be able to pick up a win, and against one of the worst teams in the league at that, is super surprising. As soon as anybody gets excited about KT Rolster, all of a sudden they start underperforming. Not the case in this one. A lot of contenders, I would say, for player of the series. Overall, pretty much everybody on KT played well. I think a lot of people want to give it to Keen for that game number 2 on the Jax, where he just obliterated Rascal on the top side and really took over the game in the side lane. You could give it to Cuz because he was just so impactful in both of these games, both early and late, in setting up a lot of the advantages that the rest of the team had. But I'm going to give it to BDD in the mid lane. He genuinely has been very good over the course of the year so far, which is so good to see. Obviously had a really down year last year on Nongshim. A lot of those players weren't necessarily, working together in the best of ways, I would say, and BDD, I think, suffered a lot. He wasn't looking good, even on some of his more classic champions, obviously, like the Azir, but moving him over to KT, putting him on an organization and with a roster that I think has a little bit more cohesion, and just generally speaking, a little bit more of a understanding of how to win games, has certainly worked out for him. He has gotten pretty much immediately back into Gen.G form or Longju form, or whichever version of BDD you like the most. This is one of the best versions of BDD we've had in quite a while. He looked really good in the series. An amazing game 1 on Taliyah. That's really where I think he stood out as like the best player of the series, was in game number 1, where he was everywhere on the map doing a ridiculous amount of damage. This reminded me a lot of what I talked about Xiaohu and Rookie doing a lot in 2022 in the LPL, picking something like Taliyah and just being able to be a resource carry, even though you're not a champion that is designed to do so. Really impressive stuff. And then a really good Aurelia game 2. Obviously, those melee mids are very contentious in the LCK, but BDD is so good, and he, quite frankly, is so much better than Fate that it ended up not really being a huge problem here. So he's going to get my player of the series, but like I said, the entire top side of KT Rolster looked awesome. Keen was awesome on the Jax, almost won game 2 by himself. Obviously, the rest of the team played well. Credit to Cuz on the Elise, who had a really dominant early game in game number 2, really set them apart and made it so much easier to close out. And he also did a fantastic job on the Wukong in game number 1, being able to generate some early leads over Krako and then just being able to spread them mostly to the Taliyah. But then, because Taliyah was fed, that kind of got spread around the map in general. So Keen, Cuz, BDD, all really stepping up, being some of the more interesting pieces in the LCK period right now. BDD and Cuz have really worked together well as a mid-jungle duo, and I'm hoping it stays that way. And then credit to Lehens. I actually think it's kind of crazy that Aiming was probably the least impactful player on KT Rolster in this series. That is a good sign, because Aiming is a good player, and he really was kind of, pushing them forward, I would say, through the beginning half of the year, to see him, kind of be, I don't want to say the weak link, because he wasn't bad by any stretch, but the member that I think is the least important on a team full of, players with question marks. That is an awesome sign. So really happy that Lehens is still undefeated on Singed support in the LCK, which is just an absurd stat, something that only Lehens can pull off. And then Aiming looked really good on the Draven. Draven Singed is just such a funny bot lane combo. As for DRX on the other side, they just suck. There really is no other way to put it. They go up against an actually good team in KT Rolster, one of the best teams in the LCK, and they're just not going to be able to hold their weight in this kind of contest. Fate is going to get my dud of the series. I think basically everybody on this team has regressed so much from the beginning of the season. It's actually insane. Even at the beginning of the year, they were at least holding tough. You saw players like Rascal really stepping up and actually being a driving force, even though they weren't winning games early on, but he has completely fallen off. Krako is super inconsistent, and I really don't like him going for more aggressive picks like Nidalee when he's not playing as well. Fate really has not been good this year. I know a lot of people are saying he's elo stuck. I do not think he has helped the problem at all. Really, the only player that has shown any signs of life during this big losing streak that they're on right now is Dektum at the AD carry position, but even then, he can't win a laning phase to save his life. He's just good at team fighting, and so really, there's not a lot of positives to talk about for DRX. This is one of the worst teams in the LCK, if not the single worst team in the LCK, and I don't really see a lot of ways for them to change that around as long as these players continue to play in this manner. Dektum and Beryl can win you games if you get to the back end. I mean, maybe not Beryl. Obviously, he's been kind of bad. Pulling out the anti-support didn't exactly work, but, you know, Dektum is someone who can win you games if he's relatively even at, like, 25 minutes. That's what he's really good at. That's always been kind of his niche as a team fighter, but you gotta have somebody who can get you there. Krako's had moments where he's looked like he can get people there, but for the most part, he's kind of just been blah, like, for the year. Rascal and Fate have completely fallen off. It just doesn't feel like there's a lot of cohesion, a lot of synergy. This feels like the Nongshim of 2023, where a lot of good players, none of them play well together, and all of them forgot how to win. And so that's really where we're at for DRX. They are a bad team with okay talent that is probably just never going to have it come together unless you start making some changes. So overall, DRX genuinely just looks like one of the worst teams in the league, and I really don't expect their fortunes to change anytime soon. But for KT Rolster, huge win, very, very positive on them and how they played at the beginning of the year. Big credit to the top side of this map. Obviously, Aiming and Lehens are very good. We've talked about how good they are, but Keen, Cuz, and BDD are really stepping up in the recent weeks, and that's what's really caused KT to leapfrog their way into, I would say, like the top 3, top 4 teams in the LCK at the moment. If they continue to play at this level, they could legitimately be a team that contests for the LCK trophy in spring, and I know a lot of KT fans are going to be super excited to hear about that, but hopefully we don't get too jazzed up, because that's, of course, as we all know, when everything comes crumbling down for KT. Moving on to our second series now of day number 1. We had another interesting series, a team that is on the up and up versus a pretty bad team in the league again here, as we saw Nongshim RedForce taking on Hanwha Liiv Esports, and HLE picks up the win. It's absolutely what should happen here. It really does feel like HLE is at least kind of back on track, or they're getting back on track. I know a lot of us expected them to be one of the best teams in the entire league. I was much more hesitant on Hanwha as a team going into the year. I think I had them 4th in my power rankings, but even then, I really didn't think you could justify putting them all that much lower than that. That is not what they have been in 2023 so far, but this series is a lot better. I think the last few series, I think a lot of their problems have been ironed out. Just, I would say, from them just playing a tad bit more safe, from them playing a tad bit more controlled, allowing their superior team fighting and allowing their superior decision-making towards the end of games to really just be able to carry them, and that's kind of what happened. I think a couple players have really stepped up, some players that were struggling early on in the year. The first one that you have to point out is Viper in the bot lane. Obviously, a lot of people, me included, thought Viper was going to come in here to the LCK and just immediately continue to be one of, if not the best AD carry in the world, because that's what he has been for the last few years, is one of the best AD carries in the world, but it's certainly been a rocky start to 2023 for him. Him and Life really have not hit it off as a bot lane here on Hanwha Life, and overall, I was definitely getting a little concerned that this was just going to be a good bot lane and not one of the best, like I think they really should be, but Viper has really stepped it up, I would say, in the past few series, especially this one. He led the entire team in KP, which is pretty nuts coming from a bot laner, especially way over your support, way over your jungler. Super impressive stuff coming out from him. He was getting himself involved. His positioning is near perfect. It's really getting back to that stage on EDG where his mid games felt basically untouchable. And that's the Viper that this team, quite frankly, needs to have in order for them to hit a lot of the goals that I think they had in the preseason. He has been a little up and down, but really what he needs to be is a driving force that they can play through, because as good as Zeka has been, and I'll get to him, he was really good in this series, but he's been good this year. He's not the kind of player that you want to play through every single game. I like Zeka. Everybody on this channel knows I'm probably the biggest Zeka fan in the entire world. That's probably the case, but he's the kind of player that you really want, ideally, to be your main secondary carry, because you don't want to rely on his, crazy antics in order to win every single game. You want to have some other condition that you can kind of go to, like DRX had last year in Deft. And so that can be Viper. That absolutely can be Viper for Hanwha Life, and you're really, really hoping it can be that. You're hoping that he can get a little bit more consistent, be able to, pretty consistently generate leads, I would say, in the bot lane, and then translate those into his notoriously strong mid games, and then Zeka can just be that really consistent secondary carry that can make a lot of these crazy plays, but doesn't necessarily need to be kind of controlled in how he performs in order for the team to succeed. I think that is their best shot at being a consistently good, consistently winning team, and that's what we saw in this series. Viper and Zeka were the two best players, and I think that's a recipe for success, especially if this bot lane is going to continue to improve. Klid with another solid series after a disastrous start to the year. It has been pointed out to me that Klid on Sejuani is a different beast from Klid on every other champion. He's like 0-9 or something with a 1 KDA on Sejuani, and that's really, really bad. And I think that Hanwha Life is starting to learn that. More Wukong, more Viego, more carry-oriented picks coming out of the jungle for him to have a little bit more proactivity in the mid game. Again, I really do think that's where Hanwha is supposed to shine. I talked about that a lot in my preseason predictions. If they can just kind of get back to that zone where, they're good in the early game, but they separate themselves a lot in that, 10 to 20 minute margin. I think if they can get back to that, they're going to be really strong, and that's what they did in this series. But for Nongshim, you actually had a couple of moments where I thought you looked relatively good in this series. It's the same story as it has been pretty much the entire year for this RedForce team, and that's they have really good hands, and they're really able to play, especially early on in games. They're able to keep up with really talented players like Viper, like Zeka, like King, and like Klid, players that we know are strong in their individual plays. But when you get to those late games, when you get to the part of the game where you have to make these tough decisions, where it comes down to the part of the game where you can't be in the wrong spot, that's where Nongshim really starts to suffer. And I think, again, that's just a rookie thing, right? It's something that I would expect them to get better at as they play more in League. However, that is something I would be worried about developing if it doesn't start developing, right? That's one thing that somebody on the team or somebody in the organization does have to at least be there to tell you, like, this is the right way to do things, or else, you can know what the wrong thing is to do, really well, but that doesn't exactly tell you what the right thing is to do. And it'll be interesting to see if this team can grow and adapt, but we know they are mechanically talented. They're just really not able to get it done when it comes to the macro. My dud of the series, again, a little bit of a tough choice. There really wasn't a lot of good options. I don't think anybody stood out on Nongshim as being particularly awful. That's been most of their series, though. Most of their losses is nobody really stands out as being particularly bad. It's mostly just them getting outplayed by their opponents. But for me, my dud of the series is going to go to Sylvie in the jungle. I like Sylvie as a player, but he really has not been a difference maker at the LCK level this year, and I'm not exactly sure that's going to happen in 2023. I was really hopeful that him and Fiesta in particular would develop a really nice jungle mid duo. I really liked both of those players coming into the LCK this year, but it just really hasn't happened, at least at the level that they're going to need to in order for them to win a lot of games. So Sylvie's going to get done of the series. You could give it to, like, Din Din in the top lane, but he was, for the most part, fine. He had a really good game number one. You could give it to, like, Fiesta, who was kind of irrelevant the entire series, but Sylvie getting out jungled by Klid in the early game, especially in the mid game, and just kind of watching it fall over and then having game one happen where it's like, you just got to be able to make the right decisions, but you're not able to do that. It can get a little bit frustrating, and I don't want to blame it all on the jungler, but that's definitely where the mind goes to. So overall for Nongshim, they are not very good, but that's okay. They're not supposed to be very good. They show up and they, try their best and they show signs, but at the end of the day, they're not really going to be able to take games and series off of some of the top teams in the league, and that is perfectly acceptable. They are an okay 10th place team. You're going to find out this split who you like, who you don't. If you're Nongshim as an organization, you can figure out who you want to invest in, who you maybe want to not invest in after this split or after this year, and maybe it gives you a better idea of where you want to go into the future. It honestly does remind me a bit of DRX from 2021, I want to say, when they were just trying out that big young roster, but hopefully this has a little bit of a better success rate because that roster didn't turn out too well. I like a lot of the players, just not expecting a lot of results right now. As for Hanwha, you're in a good spot. You're above 500 for the first time since last week, but that was the first time this whole year. You're at 12-11, which is good, 5-4, which is really, really good. You just got to be able to keep it up. It's always just going to be a consistency thing for this Hanwha Life team because we know they're talented. We know they have the skill to be able to beat basically anybody in the entire region. It's just about making sure you get the good performances of your players instead of the bad ones. When Viper is stepping up like he is here, when Klid is having a good series, Hanwha is genuinely a team to be reckoned with, and I hope we see more of that as we go further on in the LCK split. Moving on now to day number 2, and we kick day number 2 off with an interesting matchup, I guess, on paper. Not really. The top and the bottom are definitely in this one, and it went as expected. We saw BRION taking on Dplus KIA, and DK picks up the win. Not particularly surprising. I think a lot of people, me included, really wanted to see DK come out and just kind of beat up on BRION because they should. That's what they should be doing. And they've really struggled to beat up on the teams that they should be beating in recent weeks. Obviously, the loss to KT comes to mind. I believe they also lost to Liiv SANDBOX as well. Some kind of frustrating losses in the mix there for this Dplus team. Maybe it was Hanwha. It was one of those other teams that are kind of in the playoff race, but this was a good showing. I think this is what I kind of wanted to see for them to be a little bit more comfortable. Like, some of their players have not necessarily been performing up to expectations, I would say, at the start of the year. And those players, I think, played well. I think the main one that you have to point out is Showmaker in the mid lane, who has honestly been probably this team's worst player, I would say, over the first 4 weeks of the season, which is not a good sign, because Showmaker is very, very good as a player. Probably, you know, a top 2-3 mid laner of all time. So to see him really showing up here and not really being all that good at the beginning of the year, it's definitely a little concerning, especially when the downtick definitely started towards the end of last year. It's definitely concerning, but this series was much better. He goes up against, quite frankly, much weaker competition in Karis in the mid lane, who's just not going to be able to hold up against what he is able to put out, and so Showmaker is able to basically just gain control of an early lane and then translate that to anywhere he wants to go. The LeBlanc, obviously, a very signature pick for Showmaker, even if I don't think it's particularly good in the meta right now. If you're that good on a champion, just play it. Like, especially if you're Showmaker, just get back to comfort, stop overcomplicating the issue. Canyon played off of him really well, and that game 1 was good. I would say Bro definitely had some opportunities in that game number 1 to have some moments, but overall it was pretty shit, I would say, from Bro, and so Dplus was just able to kind of run away with it. And then game 2, he gets on the Talia, little less, like, directly impactful. I felt like game 1, it was like, oh, LeBlanc, 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 like, everywhere. Game number 2, a lot more about Kana here on the Renekton, a lot more about Deft on the Aphelios, but still a really good game from him on the Talia. I think overall, he was probably the most impactful member because of that game 1 performance, where he really just was able to win mid lane super hard and then take over the map, but outside of that, I felt like almost everybody on Dplus played well. Like I said, Kana had a great game 2 here on the Renekton. It really is his signature pick, as it is for most LCK top laners. You know, Morgan's also, you could probably consider that his signature pick as well, but to see Kana, you know, be able to pull it out here in game 2 and look really good on it, I think is a good sign. He wasn't super impressive on the Fiora in game number 1, but comparatively to, I guess, what he's been putting out in some of these series where he hasn't been nearly as good, I think this is definitely an upgrade in my opinion. He just needs to be stable in the top lane. He doesn't need to be the hero for this team. You have a lot of people who can win the game for you. Canyon and Deft by themselves have done a lot of that this year already, and you've got Showmaker in the mid lane, and so Kana doesn't have to be the hero for this team. I think he's slowly starting to learn that, but he can have some really good games here or there, and I think this was one of them. And then other players I want to shout out, of course, Deft and Kellen. They've maybe been the best bot lane in the LCK. Obviously, Guma and Keria are right there with them. Those have been the best too, but Deft and Kellen absolutely deserve the honorable mention there. They weren't particularly good on the Lucianami in game 1. I was actually a little disappointed in how they were not really able to generate consistent leads. Henna actually played really well in game number 1, which I'll talk about when I get to the Bro side, but Deft was honestly a little outmatched in that lane, which was weird to see, but a much better game. Him jumping on the Aphelios in game number 2. A Damwon or a Dplus classic from Dectum last year, bringing the Aphelios back out here. It's something that a lot of players on this team have a lot of familiarity playing around, and overall I think Aphelios is honestly slept on as an ADC. I know he's not particularly fantastic in a meta where you really do want to win the early laning phase, but he's not a disaster early on, and if you can get to that mid to late game relatively even, you're still Aphelios. You're still going to absolutely destroy people. So Deft and Kellen were good, Kana was good, but Showmaker was really the one that was good in both games, I would say, so he's going to get my player of the series. As for BRION on the other side, they are who we think they are. I know I say that a lot on this channel nowadays, but this series did not surprise really at all. They got destroyed, and they should get destroyed, because on paper, they are a worse team. I do think there were some good performances that I want to point out, most notably Henna in the bot lane. I thought Henna was actually really good. I'm much lower on Henna, I think, than some other analysts. I've been seeing some people rank him around like 5 or 6 in terms of LCK AD carries. I'm just not in that ballpark. He's going to be somewhere lower than that for me. I think he's fine. He's serviceable as an ADC, but not someone who's going to push you over the edge. But I will say, this was actually a really enlightening and I would say intriguing performance for Henna. He hasn't had a lot of performances where he's come out and just played like this against a really good team. So to see him do that, he had a really good game 1 on the Zeri. That was really the impressive part, was definitely what I wanted to highlight. But dud of the series is going to stay in the bot lane for Bro, and it's going to go to Effort. And I know the scoreline really isn't all that bad. You're probably looking at Karis, who got completely bodied by Showmaker in Game 1, or who just had zero pressure on the map in this entire series as kind of the duds of the series. But for me, watching Effort play these games was not fun. I know I'm a little bit of an Effort hater on this channel. I talked about it a ton over the course of last year. He was the single worst player in the LCK. I mean, On Fleek tried his best, but Effort, I think, held that crown pretty unanimously. Had to be replaced midway through the year for a team that was really struggling. He comes over here, gets an opportunity on Bro, and has been okay to start the year. Certainly not a disaster. They've won some laning phases, which has surprised me. I thought this would be a bad bot lane, but really where Effort still does not shine and has never shined is in these team fights, where he's just atrociously bad. Go watch game number 2 on that Nami. I don't think he hit anybody with ultimate. I don't think he hit a bubble. Like, you gotta be able to do something on that champion in the back half of those games to have any sort of impact, but he was just out of position, not hitting skill shots, not really contributing anything. It was a very disappointing performance for him. He didn't really, have a great game 1 either, I would say. Not that he was atrocious. I think that obviously Karis was pretty bad in game 1, but it was just really hard for me not to give it to Effort when it was like, golly, I could have probably hit some skill shots in that team fight. So overall, not a very good series, I would say, from him. Not a good series from Karis in the mid lane. Not a good series from in the jungle. I'm not particularly surprised, though. I mean, it's less talented players going into Canyon, Showmaker, Deft, Kellen. Like, these are some of the best players in their positions in the entire world. So Bro losing this, they're just kind of getting closer, I think, to where we all thought they would be. Remember, going into this year, we all unanimously pretty much thought they were going to be a bottom 2 team. To see them be relevant, like, I'd say they're better than the consensus bottom 3 teams in the LCK right now. I would consider that a positive for Bro, even if they're not that much better, and they're still going to fall to teams like Dplus relatively easily. But for DK, really good bounce back series. You absolutely needed it. I was getting very concerned with the momentum of this team going into this week, but you get a really easy series against Bro. Hopefully you can carry a lot of that momentum into some of the harder games that you play, because certainly no easy games in the LCK for any of these teams, and it's definitely going to get harder as the week goes on. Moving on now to our second series of day number 2, and it's an interesting one. Again, one that you would expect to be a little bit more of a blowout, but this one was actually very close and very, very back and forth. We had the Kwangdong Freecs taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G does pick up the win, as they absolutely should here, against a very young KDF team, but it was not nearly the kind of dominating win that you would have hoped to have seen from this Gen.G team. They've been a little bit, I would say, over the course of the last few games. I like Gen.G as a team a lot. There's a reason I have them second in my power rankings above a team like, KT Rolster or Dplus KIA or whoever else, Liiv SANDBOX, whoever else you may want to put in that conversation. There's a reason Gen.G has earned that number 2 spot to me. It's because this mid-jungle duo might just be the best in the world, and Pez is an emerging superstar in the LCK right now. But sometimes they have some bad games, and they actually had a couple of rocky games, I would say, in this, even though they won. One player who was not particularly rocky in this series was Chovy. I was actually pretty critical of Chovy last week when they suffered their second loss of the season to KT Rolster. I was very critical of the idea that he hasn't really been given the keys to the kingdom on Gen.G. I understood it a bit more last year, obviously. Played definitely more of a secondary carry role on that Gen.G team last year because they wanted to play through Ruler a lot, and Peanut was the one who was kind of getting a lot of the early game focus, and so Chovy definitely took more of a backseat supportive role in that team dynamic. But when you look at Gen.G here this year, I understand wanting to integrate Pez, I understand wanting to give Doran some time, but they really had not played for Chovy up until this point in the season, and I really wanted to see them do that in a more aggressive way. Well, this was the series where they did that, and he paid it back in dividends, in full. You had the Victor game in game 1, which was really solid, but it's really about the Akali game in game 3. If he's not playing nearly as well on that Akali as he did in that game 3, I do not think Gen.G walks out of that game with a win. We can talk about KDF actually playing well in this series because they did. I thought Bulldog in particular, really fun to watch. Taiyun certainly had his moments. I thought Youngjae, Dudu, June, everybody on the team had moments in this series where they looked good, but for Gen.G, you had to rely on your best player to bail you out of a situation where you were losing against a team that is worse than you, and luckily for you, he stepped up, and he was really good here. Chovy's player of the series, and hopefully he's going to have more performances like this as the year goes on. He's definitely been more, I would say, quiet, passive. Those are the words I would use to start the year compared to some of his teammates like Pez, like Peanut, who I think have been a little bit more flashy in terms of how they have actively impacted the game. Hopefully, this is the turning point for Chovy that kind of puts him into that conversation, allows him to get a bit more resources, and allows him to kind of cook a tad bit more. I don't think anybody else on Gen.G was particularly bad. I thought Doran in particular had some really good games, in particular Game 3, where I thought he was really solid on the Jace towards the back half, but Chovy was the one who kind of saved the series for Gen.G. I don't think Pez and Delight were nearly as good as they have been towards the beginning part of the year. Taiyun and June did a really good job of neutralizing and almost winning a lot of these laning phases. Delight had some good moments on the Leona, but I wasn't really super pleased about how Pez played this series. And then Peanut, you know, he was the engager. Sometimes the engages worked, sometimes they didn't. So a little bit of back and forth there. It really was up to Chovy to kind of make a lot of these plays work for Gen.G, and luckily for them, he did. As for KDF on the other side, I would say a frustrating loss, but you're going to be happy to be in this circumstance in the first place because you were going up against one of the best teams in the league, and you truly did hold your own. Like, you looked solid, especially coming off of a week where you looked pretty good. You got your win over Nongshim. A week before that, you got your win over KT Rolster, who looks really solid. Like, this team absolutely can win games and does have talent. For them to be able to take a game off of Gen.G here and honestly make Game 3 as interesting as it was up until everything fell apart, that's a really good thing. Bulldog, like I said, was definitely the standout, I would say, for KDF, as he has probably been the entire year. I feel like Bulldog and Dudu are definitely the two best players on this team so far. Unfortunately, that didn't translate into this series, as Dudu's going to get my dud of the series. He was actually pretty good in that Game 3 early on the Renekton. He was able to get a lot of stuns off, but by the end of that game, he was legit running it down in a lot of these team fights and actively, quite frankly, lost his team a lot of pressure on the map. If he had played slightly better, if him and Youngjae together had played slightly better in that mid game, KDF was actually in a really interesting spot. Unfortunately, they took a relatively decent position and threw it away incredibly quickly, which is always a little disappointing. But Dudu's been good outside of that, and he showed moments in lane where he was really solid in the series, just not the whole package. The other player I want to shout out, Taiyun. I know I already talked about it a bit, but Taiyun was actually pretty solid in this series. I think you can make a real argument he was just straight up better than Pez in this series, which is pretty crazy to say, as good as Pez has been to start the year. Taiyun and June really have not clicked as the KDF bot lane, in my opinion. Definitely the weak link of the team to start the year, but this was a really pleasant series, and I think it gives me a lot of confidence that they have the room and the opportunity to grow. Obviously, they really haven't shown it a ton at the LCK level yet, but this might just be their best series in the LCK here in 2023 so far, so hopefully they can just build on that. But outlook-wise for both of these teams, KDF is probably who we think they are. I think the bottom three are pretty locked in, although they might be able to jump up to like number 7 or something if BRION continues to struggle, but I don't think KDF is some sort of playoff team, even though they were able to push Gen.G. I just don't think they have the complete package, the complete, overarching story to kind of push them into the playoffs. A lot of their flaws were exposed here, which is the mid-game decision-making. We talked about that with Nongshim. It definitely exists for KDF as a rookie team as well. And then for Gen.G, you're going to be very happy to get out of the series with a win. Very much could have gone a different way, but you're sitting at 7-2. You're still looking really good in terms of record and in terms of playoff push. Hopefully you can just keep it up. If you can get a better performance out of your bot lane, you're going to consistently win a lot more games. But lucky for you, you have one of, if not the single best player in the world to bail you out, even when the rest of your team isn't playing perfect. And that's just a luxury that, Chobi teams have that others just do not. Moving on now to the middle of the week, we've got our Day 3 games coming up, and Day 3 kicked off with a really intriguing matchup, at least on paper, a battle of two teams that are very high up in the standings, as we saw T1 taking on Liiv SANDBOX, and T1 is able to take the series 2-1, but SANDBOX is able to look really, really good in a Game 1 win. Now, I don't want to overanalyze this win for SANDBOX because it is T1, and at the end of the day, anybody can beat T1 in one game. That is just what we know from being LCK fans, whether it's SANDBOX, whether it's Dplus KIA, whether it's Gen.G, or whether it's DRX and Nongshim and KDF. Anybody's going to be able to beat T1 in one game because they're going to make some ridiculous plays. They're going to pick Yasuo top lane, and they're going to lose, right? But I do think that there are some encouraging signs that lead me to believe that this isn't just another team losing to T1, right? I do think that Liiv SANDBOX had some good moments. We'll get into that in a bit. But let's talk about T1 first and foremost. When they get mad, they just get really, really good at League of Legends. It's actually insane. It's probably the reason they let so many teams take like Game 1, Game 2. Because when they have their backs against the wall, I'm just not sure there's a better team in the entire world. Pretty much everybody here is playing at an all-time level right now, and it's really hard to distinguish one player from being better than the other. But there's a special place in my heart for KIA, and I'm imagining that a lot of other LCK fans are probably on that train as well. He's going to get another player of the series here, and I know it just feels like I'm giving it to him because, I like KIA, and the innovative stuff he's doing is really cool, and yada, yada, yada. Maybe he's just, like, the talk of the town right now. I think we know on this channel, hopefully those of you who have watched this channel for an extended period of time know that I'm not really the type of person to just jump on the bandwagon, to jump on the narrative. I try to go for maybe more of the actual who was the best player in this series, and it just always is KT. Like, you can watch all of these games, and the first person you are always noticing is KT. It's absolutely absurd. His Lux came in game 2, utterly dominant, completely obliterated that bot lane in lane, and then made a ton of transitions into the mid game that made it really problematic and really difficult to win. And then the Annie in game 3, it's like, oh, where'd the Annie go? Oh, Envy's dead. Like, it was so instantaneous on how often KT was making a strong impact on the game and how literally no one could stop him. He is, for my money, right now, genuinely the best player in the world, and I think he continues to prove that. He is making a very strong case to be the LCK MVP, and I think he would have to really have a disaster of a second half of the season in order to really fall out of that argument, because right now he is just playing at such a ludicrously good level, and it's very, very difficult to not call that out. Credit to Gumayushi, you have to have a good lane partner in order to succeed at this level, and Guma and KT are absolutely that. Maybe Guma's not exactly as flashy as KT has been over the first couple of weeks, which is crazy to say about an AD carry compared to a support, but Guma has been just as important and just as integral towards T1's success. This could just be the best bot lane in the world right now, and I really don't think there are going to be a lot of people out there that are putting arguments up against that one. I think another thing that I have to point out, Faker's having a legit all-time kind of season right now out of the mid lane. I know we're all talking about KT and how good KT has been in the bot lane, but Faker is the best mid in the LCK right now, and I don't think it's particularly close. BDD's had a good year, a player like Closer's had a good year, we've talked about him, but I mean, Faker is just on a different level in terms of how he's been able to play the game right now. This is the best season that he has been having, or that he has had in quite a long time, in my opinion. And that's awesome to see. It really does feel like the cohesion of T1 has really come together to make a perfect storm for a player like Faker to just play at the highest level. He's being allowed to play some of these more carry-oriented picks, unlike what he was doing last year when he was on Talia duty most of the season, Lissandra duty most of the season. Now he gets Akali, now he gets Corki, he gets these champions that can actively try and make plays in the mid to late game, and man, did Faker make some plays. He absolutely dominated Closer in the mid lane matchup. Owner was awesome. He's got like a 90% win rate on Lee Sin all time. Zeus was cool in every game that wasn't the Yasuo. Overall, T1 is just unstoppable when they're playing at the highest level that they can play at, and it's never not fun to watch. As for SANDBOX on the other side, though, unfortunately, they're just not as talented as T1. They were able to take a game number 1, some really good plays being made by the bot lane in that game. The Lucian Nami really took over the laning phase into that Zeri Lulu and kind of propelled them to a win. Kale was phenomenal on the Nami. Everybody who watches this channel knows how high I am on Kale as a player. I think he might just be the second or third best support in Korea right now, but unfortunately, he's going into number 1. So after game number 1, it wasn't particularly good for the bot lane, especially in game number 3, where it felt like they had zero impact on the Ezreal Karma other than Envy just constantly being in the wrong spot. But my dud of the series is going to go to Closer in the mid lane. Now, he didn't make any egregious errors in the same way that, like, Envy, I thought, made some egregious errors, and Kale at points made some egregious errors in this series, but Closer was an NPC, like, this entire series. Even in their win, the Akali game was fine, it was okay, but then the 2 games of Azir, I can't remember a single thing that he did in this entire series. Not only did he lose lane to Faker pretty hard, he had no impact on the map, he wasn't really able to help out his jungler at all, and then really wasn't doing a lot of damage in the team fights. It very much just felt like a very muted, poor performance from somebody who's been having a very good season so far. I hate to say this because I know a lot of people in my comment section and on Reddit definitely disagree with me on this, but I'm in a very similar position with Closer that I was at the beginning of this year and that I was last year. I think he's a really good mid laner at this level and someone who can win games, but I don't think he's a superstar. Like, I don't think he's a top 3 or 4 mid laner in the LCK. I think he's a good player, but I think when he goes against really good players, he does at times tend to get a little exposed, especially when he's not on the champions that he himself personally thrives on. The Akali, the Sylas, Aurelia, these melee mids that he has been known for. When he's not on that, when he's on something like the Azir, I do think the quality of his performance drops off drastically, and I think we saw that in this one here. But Bertle, Willer, everybody on this team kind of were just meh over the past few games and good in the first one. I really do think that was the end-all be-all for SANDBOX. So what does it mean for them overall? It's not the worst loss in the world to lose to the best team in the LCK, but to at least take a game off of them and to look relatively competitive doing it, even if he kind of got blown out in the last 2 games, is still a relatively good sign. And for Envy and Kale to have such a good game 1, you're at least building something here. Willer's been really solid. Bertle was my player of the week last week. Closer's been maybe the most dominant player on the team, at least in terms of overall success. SANDBOX is still a really good team, just not number 1 in the league, but T1 absolutely is number 1 in the league, and it's due to the fact that everybody on this team is playing at the best level that they've played at in a long time. Guma and KT might be the best bot lane in the world. Faker legitimately might be the best mid laner in the world right now. Owner can't lose when he's playing incredibly aggressive like this, and Zeus can do whatever he wants. He's been the best top laner in the world for an entire year now, so T1 genuinely looks kind of unbeatable at the moment unless they beat themselves, and that might be one of the scariest prospects you can have for a team like this in spring. Moving on now to our second series of day number 3, and it's a pretty good one. Obviously, a pretty heated battle because of some player rivalries that we have here. We have Hanwha Liiv Esports taking on DRX. Obviously, Hanwha was able to come out on top. That's really not surprising to anybody. I say obviously, this is a series that I guess they could have lost, but they didn't. DRX is in a complete landslide right now, but always fun to see these two teams play off. Second time this year they've done it. Kingen and Zeka obviously won a world title last year on DRX. Beryl is still there, so it's always fun to see these two teams play against each other. But Hanwha Life definitely with the edge here. They actually had some moments where they were looking a little bit bad in game number 2 towards the beginning part, but doesn't really matter. It all kind of falls apart as soon as Rascal gives over basically every ounce of gold he has to Hanwha Life. But let's talk about HLE first and foremost. Couple players playing really well here. Gotta point out my player of the series, Kingen, in the top lane. I actually thought he was spectacular, especially in that game number 2. Gnar has very much become like that signature champion that I associate with Kingen, maybe outside of the Aatrox, obviously, because of Worlds, but he's never really out of games on a pick like Gnar. Obviously, Gnar does a great job transitioning into the late game so long as you're not, like, ridiculously far behind. And while he did give up definitely some pressure early on in game number 2, he did a great job being able to rebound it and be able to gain it back, I would say, from Rascal, who was making some horrible decisions. Really capitalized on one major mistake that Rascal was able to make after a lot of gold, I should say, going over to Rascal early on in the game. And then basically from that point on, it was Kingen off to the races, having impact play after impact play after impact play on this Gnar. An incredibly impressive performance coming out from him, and that's what you really wanted to see for Hanwha. We've been talking about Zeka and Viper kind of being the carry points, and Klid, when this team wins, has also been very good, but Kingen really should be stepping up on the top lane. This team should have kind of a three-headed beast in terms of the lanes that they have. Kingen should be able to win a lot, even on weak side like he did last year for DRX. It was actually a big turnaround, and a big reason why DRX was actually able to win a lot last year was because I really do think that Kingen had easily the best year of his career in 2022. So, hopefully he can get some of that momentum back here. This is a very good start. Going into a good top laner, maybe one, though, that is having a really bad stretch of games. Obviously, my dud of the week last week in Rascal, and so definitely some negatives to talk about there, but Kingen definitely deserved to get some credit for playing well and being able to translate that lead into something. And then also the other player that you have to shout out on this team is Viper. I want to shout out Life as well. This was probably Life's most coherent series as a starter this year in 2023. Life has certainly been a little bit of a problem towards the beginning part of the season for Hanwha. However, this series was a lot better, I would say, overall for him. Certainly not nearly as up and down, a lot more up. I would say bot lane was definitely in favor of Hanwha Life. You could say that's in favor of anyone that's not Beryl, which we'll get to in a second, but Viper really was the big damage carry on this team. You could talk about Kingen doing a really good job setting up plays on the Gnar in game number 2, but it was Viper really kind of making them come true on the Zeri, and then also a phenomenal game number 1 on the Caitlyn. Viper genuinely looks like one of the best AD carries in the LCK right now, which is what we wanted to see going into the year. That was the expectation. It was not that at the beginning, and so it's really good to kind of see him get back into that zone. As for DRX on the other side, you're starting to get like, oh, okay, this team is like just bad. Like, they're not competitively bad. They're just bad. They don't have any chance of really rebounding. You're finally starting to make some changes to the roster. Krako starts game number 1. He is atrocious, gets completely out-jungled by Klid, actively throws the game away basically by himself. They end up switching him out for Juhan in the jungle position. Obviously, Juhan played a good amount last year, actually qualified them for the World Championships when Pioshik was playing garbage over the course of the back half of the regular split there, and so I'm all for giving Juhan a shot, especially because in game 2, Juhan did a really good job of actually being able to generate a strong early lead, not only for DRX, but for himself. It was just Rascal throwing basically everything away, and then Beryl having a legit terrible series, and then you're not able to win from there. But honestly, Juhan looked a lot better, and I would expect to see him in the starting role, but that does not save Krako from getting dud of the series, even only playing one game. I think Juhan coming in and looking so much better honestly gave me the confidence to give Krako the dud of the series, because Krako was atrocious in game 1, and then you had someone come in with the same team around him and do so much better in game number 2. That is not a good sign for how well you are playing. I think Krako's been okay considering the circumstance for DRX this year. I certainly don't think he's been a positive for the team, but I think a lot of players on this team have been a negative. Beryl and Rascal definitely come to mind, but this was atrocious from Krako. And you do have like a ready-made upgrade in Juhan, someone who has been able to play at this level at a relatively decent pace before, and so I would expect to see more of Juhan just because you gotta find something that's working, and this just seems to be the direction I would go in. You gotta talk about Rascal. The scoreline looks pretty good because he was okay in game 1, and he had a lot of gold in game number 2, but he basically just completely threw it away. I mean, going in when you're like 2-0 up onto a Gnar and immediately dying while the rest of your team is hitting Dragon is just one of the most unbelievable cringe plays I could possibly see in a long time. This looks like someone who was giga tilted, and I don't blame him. Obviously, the team has really sucked, but Rascal is playing his absolute worst League of Legends right now, and it's frustrating to see. The other player that you have to talk about is Beryl. Beryl has been bad for quite a few weeks now. I want to actually use this spot to talk a bit about the narrative surrounding Beryl, because if I have to read the statement, man, what happened to Beryl one more time, I'm going to lose my mind. Like, legitimately, I'm going to throw my computer out a window because I get it. Like, you all watched Worlds and he was good at Worlds. I get it. I understand that, oh, Beryl was really good on Damwon and he was really good at Worlds on DRX. That must mean that Beryl was also good all of the time in between. And anybody who watched the LCK last year will just tell you that is not the case. Beryl was really bad for a majority of summer last year. Where did this Beryl come from? This Beryl has been here for over a year. He just was really good at that one international tournament. But yes, Beryl is garbage right now. He's flipping games on a bunch of 50-50 moves, which he was doing a ton last year with DRX. It really cost Pioshik a ton of pressure, made Pioshik's job a lot harder. He's doing the absolute same to every single player that he plays with here. Dektum is living in purgatory, which I hate for him. Juhan really couldn't get anything going after Rascal gave away the early lead because Beryl was constantly in bad positions, giving more gold over to Hanwha. It just feels like a complete and utter nightmare scenario to have to play for DRX when you've got, you know, players like Beryl and players like Rascal just running it down because they're so tilted. So that's just the situation we're in. This is not new for Beryl. This is Beryl. Like, this is how he has played over the past year. It's not particularly surprising. But for DRX overall, this team sucks. Like, put them in number 10. Legitimately, I don't care. Like, they're the worst team in the league. They just have more upside, I would say, than some of the other teams or the other team that I have listed below them, which is why they've been coming in at number 9. But they play like the worst team in the league every single game, and it's not particularly close. I don't really see a way for them to get out of it, even if Juhan is good. Because, like I said, the other members of the team are just too big of hindrances at this point. But for Hanwha, on the other side, this is a really good week. This is a 4-0 week for Hanwha. This is about as good as you could ask for. They are slowly starting to rebound their image and their success rate, which is a really, really good thing. This could be a team that is genuinely dangerous once we get to playoff time, especially if they're in the form that they're in right now. Viper's playing out of his mind. Kingen was really good in the series. Zeka's been very consistent. Klid, not on Sejuani, is very good. Life had his best series. Everything is kind of clicking for HLE right now. Obviously, you want to see it against some more difficult talent, but at the very least, they're at least being able to take care of the games that they should have, which they weren't doing at the beginning of the year. Moving on now to day number 4, and day 4 action was kicked off with an interesting series. Two teams that are kind of on the cusp of at least contending for a playoff spot. We had the Kwangdong Freecs taking on BRION, both who have been kind of in opposite states in terms of momentum recently. KDF picking up some of their only wins of the season recently. Bro, on the other hand, you know, kind of coming back down to earth after their really early season good run of form. Bro, however, continues to be the better team here, and they're going to pick up this series win, moving to 4-6, moving KDF down to 2-8. Shout out to Bro. Honestly, they're so much better than I ever gave them credit for going into the year. They felt like they were pretty easily going to be one of the worst teams in the LCK. Of course, I thought KDF was going to be the worst team in the LCK, so not exactly the most dominant team to beat here, but at the very least, Bro winning a series here, a couple of series early on in the year, is a very good sign, and I really do think that this Bro team is fine. They're probably not a playoff team. I think the bottom 4 are all pretty out. I think top 6 feels very locked in at this point, but Bro is better, in my opinion, than those bottom 3 teams, and I think they proved that a lot in this series. Player of the series for me is going to go to Lord Morgan up in the top lane. How can you not give it to him? Some really good games of Gnar in games 2 and 3 that really pushed Bro over the top. I talked about this a lot last year when we had a lot of BRION versus Hanwha life, but Morgan versus Dudu almost never disappoints. It feels like these two are rivals in a sense of both of them got compared by me a lot over the course of last year because both felt like kind of middling top laners that were just making bad teams a little bit better, right? Morgan for Bro, Dudu for Hanwha life. It's not exactly the same circumstance, I would say, for either of these two teams. This year, I feel like KDF has more talent. Bulldog has definitely been interesting. Youngjae's had some moments. For Bro, you have Henna kind of stepping up. Umti's had some good games, and so it's definitely a little bit different, but still, Dudu versus Morgan never disappoints, and that was the case here. Morgan was awesome. Dudu was also really good. We'll get into that when we cover KDF, but big shout out to Morgan. He absolutely deserves player of the series. When he's able to really sink his teeth into like a more, I don't know, aggressive, engaged style champion on the top side, the Gnar comes to mind. Obviously, the Renekton comes to mind. He just plays it at such a high level. It's very fun to watch, and the Gnar definitely became that for him here. The other player that I really want to shout out is Umti. Really good series from him. He has been really good at being able to take advantage of some of the weaker teams, at least in terms of macro this year. His early game advantages are really strong when teams don't know how to respond to some of the crazy plays that he's able to make. We've seen him be able to generate those leads against teams like KDF, against teams like Nongshim. Those are the kinds of teams that I think he is going to regularly be able to generate leads on, even if I don't think he's as mechanically talented as players like Youngjae, as players like, Sylvie on Nongshim, or even like Krako on DRX. What Umti does really well is take advantage of miscommunication mistakes from the other side, and that feels like what happened here. I think you could say that Henna and Effort were definitely the better bot lane here as well, and then Karis was just kind of there in the mid lane. Karis has honestly been okay, I would say, as an LCK player this split. Certainly not a dominant player, certainly not bad either. I would say Morgan was definitely the big hero of the series, and then you got to give a shout out to Umti as well. But over on the side of KDF, they were able to take game number one. They just weren't able to transition that into anything. Huge series from Dudu. I mean, this was just so fun to watch. You can talk about his game one not exactly being perfect, even though I would argue that that was the best game for KDF as a whole. But those side lane games on Fiora in games 2 and 3 were crucial in allowing KDF to really even be in this series at all. He really stepped up, and without him, I just don't feel like KDF would have had much of a chance in this series. But unfortunately for him, the rest of the team didn't exactly come to his rescue. Where you really got to point out some major mistakes here is the bot lane. Taiyun and June kind of got run over by Henna and Effort. Not particularly surprising. Taiyun and June have pretty consistently been the worst bot lane in the LCK, but they really proved that in this series. June's going to get my dud of the series because I do think Taiyun had at least, a good game in game number one, but they were both so bad over the course of the second half of this series. The Ezreal Karma lane is not working for KDF. This is just the truth of what we've learned about Taiyun and June. I'm not sure who the problem is. I'm not sure if it's June who can't play like Lulu or Nami, or I'm not sure if it's Taiyun who doesn't play, Zeri and Lucian. Sorry, I blanked on the names for a second, but for some reason or for one reason or another, they will not play the meta bot lanes. I don't know what it is. They're not particularly good at them, maybe, but it's costing them because Siverheimer is just not good enough. Varus is going to be able to tear you apart, and he did that in all three laning phases, so shout out to Henna and Effort. They did play well, but Taiyun and June really are scaring me. They played okay earlier in the week. This was a much worse performance for them. This solidified them right back into that worst bot lane in the LCK for me, but June is going to get my dud of the series just because he was slightly less impactful, and I felt like his laning phase was slightly more obviously awful, but they weren't the only players to play bad. I thought Bulldog was pretty bad in this series. Not bad. He had moments where he looked good, but I just didn't think he was that much of an impact. Youngjae actually had some good engages, but his scoreline won't show you that on the Sejuani. Overall, this really was due to keeping KDF in the series and in a lot of these games, and unfortunately them just not being able to capitalize on it. So KDF is kind of who we think they are. Both of these teams, quite frankly, are kind of who we think they are. I think the 7-8 in the power rankings for them feels incredibly accurate now. It feels like the bottom four are all in that order. I was really interested to see this matchup because KDF had been playing better over the last few weeks, but as it turns out, Bro is still on top when it comes to these two and how they play. Bro looks good. They look better than the bottom three, but they're certainly not, playoff caliber in my opinion. I feel like top 6 is pretty locked. But still, at the end of the day, this is probably better than either team really expected going into the year, especially Bro sitting here at 4 wins halfway through the season. So you're going to take kind of the small advantages that you can get here if you're a team like BRION. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4 here. We had another interesting one that can always be an upset alert, and when you have to keep an eye out for. We saw Nongshim RedForce taking on KT Rolster. And KT does it again. They actually take care of 2 of the worst teams in the league in the same week. Like, that's not the KT I know. That's not the KT I love. Them actually being able to consistently win series, that's not KT Rolster. I'm pretty happy to see it because, man, these players are playing out of their minds right now, but pretty insane. You'll notice I actually have a little bit of a note up on the screen here. 9 out of the 10 champs, 10 out of the 10 bans the same between the games. Kind of a weird thing. You would think that Nongshim would at least, want to change something. Good for KT for just saying, what if we just did it again? And then they did it again. But, kind of weird, right? That The only major change is Din going from Gragas to K'Sante. None of the bans were different. All of them were literally exactly the same. I can't remember the last time I've seen that in a best of 3 or a best of 5 or pretty much any time in the last few years. So anytime that you guys can remember, let me know that down in the comment section. But kind of a wild stat that is definitely worth noting here. So let's talk about the series though. Let's talk about how they played. Player of the series, kind of difficult to give here, if only because everybody on KT looked freaking awesome in both of these games. They were dominant in both games under 30 minutes. But for me, pretty easy, gonna go to aiming. He's just awesome. He's just really, really good. It feels like he has evolved so much as a player in the past year that it's almost unrecognizable what he was in the LPL just a couple of years ago, right? Looking at LPL aiming and looking at, you know, LCK 2023 aiming, it's not even remotely close. For him to be able to take over games like this so consistently on the Ezreal is insane. The biggest knock that aiming always had as a player, in my opinion, was his over-aggression and his inability to consistently generate leads in the early game. That was always something that was problematic with him, is he would go for a lot of these early trades. Oftentimes they wouldn't work, and he would doom his own lane really just from not knowing matchups. It feels like that is almost all gone. He has consistently been able to generate leads against almost everyone in the entire league. Yes, Vital and Peter aren't exactly the top bot lane in the league or anything like that, but aiming's been doing this against everybody and anybody, and so I really, a lot of the problems that I had with aiming are starting to evaporate. I'm not saying that he is easily one of the top 2 or 3 AD carries in the world, like I think some people are willing to say right now. I still don't know if he makes the same kind of impact that a player like Gumayushi or a player like Ruler or a player like, you know, Viper at his absolute best can make, right? But he's very close. He is right up there with some of the other best AD carries in the entire world, and it's really good to see him come out of his shell, honestly. He's paired up with Lehens really well. That was a big concern that I had going into the season. If you went and watched my preseason predictions for KT, a reason that I was a little bit concerned about this team as a whole was I was a little bit concerned that the synergy of these two players wasn't exactly going to work out, but they have worked well together. I think Lehens has honestly made aiming's early game a tad bit better because Lehens is also willing to play that super aggressive style. He's also willing to try and take a lot of those risks that I think aiming really likes to take. This Ezreal Karma lane definitely worked out for them, but they've really been able to play anything over the course of the year so far. They are both so incredibly talented, and they really do work together well. I actually think this bot lane is also one of the scariest in the entire world. I know I've been saying that about a lot of LCK bot lanes in this video, but they absolutely deserve that designation with how they've been playing this year. The other player you have to shout out is BDD. In my opinion, you can talk about aiming, you can talk about BDD. I don't care which one you say is playing better this year. They are both so ridiculously strong right now. BDD, like I said earlier, just might be the best mid laner in the LCK right now. Faker would certainly like a word with that, but I don't really think there's anybody else that's going to be in that conversation at that same level. BDD really is fantastic. It is so good to see him kind of get back to form after what was an incredibly rough 2022. Really see him get back to comfortability on champions that he was performing poorly on last year. It's not really like these compositions are all that different, or the champions that he's picking are all that different. It just feels like he's playing with this new level of confidence, going and taking a lot of these fights, playing well with this jungler. It just feels like everything's kind of clicking for him, and that's about as good as you could possibly ask for. Cuz was awesome in this series, and he's been really good over the course of the year. I don't think he was really all that good last year in 2022, so to see him bounce back is nice. Keen's having a good season. Everything is working right now for KT Rolster, and you just gotta hope they can keep it up. As for Nongshim, they're Nongshim. I mean, they're talented, but they don't really have the talent to keep up with a team like KT, and they certainly don't have the macro to keep up with a team like KT, so they were just kind of beat in every lane, and then they just slowly lost the game. That's what happened in both games, and it's not particularly surprising. Vital is going to get my dud of the series. Bot lane was a wasteland for Nongshim. Aiming and Lehens absolutely dominated the 2v2, and unfortunately, Vital was a big, I guess, recipient of a lot of the pressure on the side of KT Rolster, and he just didn't really do a lot with it. As Varus, especially going into something like Karma or Sejuani or Jax or even Silas, like, yeah, you just have to play so safe. Like, you have to be prepared for the enemy team to target you heavily and Vital. It just didn't seem like the team was all that prepared to do that. It's not like anybody else in the team was particularly playing well. Peter on Engagers twice in a row. Don't really understand that. He wasn't particularly useful. Fiesta had zero impact on the Azir. Sylvie wasn't very good on the Vi. At least Din changed champions, but it didn't really do anything. Going from the Gragas to the K'Sante, nothing really changed. So overall, Nongshim just looking bad. I mean, really, there's no other way to put it. This was a pretty terrible series from them. They might just be the worst team in the LCK. I know a lot of people are going to put DRX there because they are probably a little bit more outwardly disappointing, but I feel like Nongshim just lacks the kind of talent that is able to keep up at the LCK level. There are players on this team that I like. I like Fiesta. I like Peter. Sylvie had some promise coming into the league. Vital had some promise coming into the league. So did Din, but none of them have really performed in 2023 so far, and it's really hard for me to project that any of them are going to do that unless there's some major, I guess, like, environment changes. As for KT Rolster, though, this team's awesome. They legitimately might be a top 1-2 team in the LCK right now. It's hard to rank the top part of the LCK. I feel like there were a lot of good teams in Korea right now. Not that that's all that surprising, but if KT continues to play at this level for the rest of the year, like, there's a very real chance they could be hoisting up the LCK trophy, and that's got to be a huge relief to hear for KT fans. Now jumping into our 5th and final day of LCK action, we had a great matchup, a top-of-the-table clash, maybe the two best teams in the region right now. We had T1 taking on Gen.G, and T1 was able to take the series 2-1. A pretty back-and-forth series, I would say, overall. Gen.G able to take game number 1, but T1 bouncing back very nicely across games 2 and 3. Definitely some mistakes coming across from both teams, which we will definitely get into, but a fun series nonetheless between two teams that basically never disappoint against each other. T1 losing game number 1. Name a better duo. It happened again, but as per usual, they're able to rebound, they're able to get back on track, and they're able to look really good towards the second half of the series. It was a pretty easy choice for player of the series for me. This one is going to go to Gumayusi in the bottom lane. 3 games of Varus, 3 very successful games of Varus. Now, obviously, we talked about in the previous entry how Varus can sometimes be a little bit of a problem pick if you're not prepared to play it a little bit safer, a little bit slower in the early game, especially going into something like Draven. You really don't want to put yourself in any sort of danger if you are the Varus in that situation, but supplementing that with AD carry supports, you know, what the carry is special, if you will, things like the Kalista, things like the Jhin, can help, can make it a lot easier in order to kind of give you that little bit of poke advantage, that little bit of pressure advantage down in the bot lane early, and I think Guma did a really good job translating that pressure. Where Guma really shines, as good as he is in the early game, I think he mostly shines in the mid to late game where he can really take over a lot of these team fights. I think he's a very complete ADC, but that part of the game for him is just so incredibly strong, and that's what we got on the Varus. You can talk about some of these team fights, most specifically the ones, you know, around Baron, around Dragon, around some of these objectives that really swung the game, especially in that game number 3. Guma was the one doing the damage. Guma was the one really stepping up and making the plays. You could talk about Faker also making some really good plays, especially in that game 3 on Annie, but to me, this was a Guma diff, and he was the best player in this series. Let's, of course, talk about Faker, though, because this was a super fun one. Obviously, a couple former teammates facing off in this one, but this was the matchup, I think, that definitely stood out the most, as we got Faker facing off against his former jungler in Peanut here, former World Finals jungler in Peanut, and man, this was a fun matchup between two players that were just constantly trying to get each other. It really felt like that was the big goal here. We'll get to Peanut in a bit, but Faker caught out, mispositioned a lot in that last game as Annie, but really came in clutch towards the back half of those team fights. Had a good game of Cassidy in game 2 as well, but certainly some mistakes and some misposition errors, even though he more than made up for it with some of his late game heroics. And then big credit to KIA, big credit to Owner, who I thought was fantastic in this series, especially being able to capitalize on the mistakes that Gen.G was making, and then Zeus was good as well. Overall, T1's just super good, super fun, super fast. When Guma and KIA are playing like this and genuinely being able to win bot lane in basically any matchup, even as Varus into Draven, that is absolutely ginormous, absolutely huge, and it makes T1 pretty much impossible to beat at this level. As for Gen.G on the other side, not an awful performance. Definitely some moments that looked really good for you. Chovy was appropriately really good in this series. That game number 1 on the Sylas was fantastic to watch, and he had some really good moments on the Victor in the last few games as well, but just the complete package wasn't quite there. You weren't able to make game 3 work. Some really bad mispositioning errors from Peanut throughout that game on the Poppy. That's why he is going to be getting my dud of the series here. I think his problems in this series were a little bit overstated, because I do think that there were definitely moments where he looked okay. He had one of the coolest plays of 2023 so far that I have to shout out. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you go find it. I can't give you the timestamp. I don't remember what it is, but this really cool play where Peanut goes for a gank in the bot lane. Delight sends out Ash Arrow, and Peanut Poppy charges Gumayusi right into the Ash Arrow for them to land that, like, big chain CC on him, which is just one of the coolest plays, I would say, that I've seen in 2023. Definitely one of the coolest coordinated plays that I've seen in 2023. Not a lot of teams are going to be able to pull something like that off, but it was really cool to watch. And obviously, they weren't able to get much else off of that, and Peanut certainly had moments where he was way too far up, way out of position, but it wasn't just him. One thing I want to actually point out here is, you know, I know I'm a little bit of a Peanut defender, and he was bad this series, trust me. Like, I'm not trying to completely defend him, but if your jungler dies and you're now down 4v5, maybe don't try to force a 4v5 team fight if you're Gen.G. I don't know who's making that call. I don't know who's going for that play, but it loses them the game on the spot. And I understand that Peanut being there, or Peanut not being there, means that you're already in a super disadvantageous position because now you can't really fight over objectives, but fighting over them anyway is just a super losing play. So Gen.G has more problems than Peanut just getting caught. They also made some pretty tragic errors, but Peanut was definitely one of the problems. Chovy was easily their best player. Pez had moments. Delight had moments, but for the most part, they were the worst bot lane here, and then Doram, Zeus, they were just kind of neutral up on the top side. Overall, I would just say that Gen.G is still a good team. Maybe not the team that we thought they were. They didn't exactly have the most impressive week overall, but they were able to at least take a game off of T1, which for the most part is a good sign. I know T1 and losing game 1 is pretty common, but they were at least able to take a game, which I think is a good sign. I'm not exactly sure where I land on Gen.G right now, but they're not really going to be falling out of the top 3. They're still a really solid team. It's just about, do I think they can compete with T1 when the games matter the most? That is still to be determined. But then for T1, I mean, this team looks genuinely untouchable right now. This is a team that truly is limit testing in a lot of these scenarios. Carius picking crazy things, Faker's picking Annie in a win-or-lose game 3 here in a best of 3, and they're destroying on it. They're being able to win on that. If they're able to win on this, imagine what's going to happen once they start picking the things that are actually dominant in the meta. It just feels like T1 is so far ahead of every other team in the LCK, and perhaps they are, and perhaps they're even that far ahead of every other team in the world. That's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in the LCK in week number 5, and it was a good one. It was Liiv SANDBOX taking on Dplus KIA, and SANDBOX picking up a massive win here. Dplus really struggling. I struggled not to call them damn one. I really do apologize if I slip up. I really am trying my best. But SANDBOX with an absolutely massive win, kind of solidifying their spot in the upper echelons of teams here in the LCK. This team is performing way above expectations, but at this point, it's for real. They have proven it basically against every team that they've needed to in the standings to show that they deserve to be in that top, 3 or 4 conversation. And this win over Dplus is really just the icing on top of the cake. Basically, everybody playing well for SANDBOX in a 2-0 win. I should note, not even a game going over to Dplus, which we'll get to. Some of their players are incredibly disappointing right now, but I gotta shout out SANDBOX. A lot of players on this team are playing well. Basically, everybody's playing at the highest level, but my player of the series is going to surprise a lot of people because it's going to go to Bertle here. And I know it might be a little bit of a narrative award because giving it to him over DK is definitely a little bit of a, look what you missed out on. But for Bertle, honestly, he was just phenomenal in both games on the Jax here. The amount of pressure that he was able to create on the top side, to me, really was the big defining difference maker for SANDBOX. I know his scoreline doesn't necessarily show it. Hell, even his CSD or his GD doesn't necessarily show it, but the amount of pressure that he was able to create on the top side of the map, the amount of pressure that he was able to put on Kana, who just wasn't able to play the game at all, in my opinion, was the biggest gap in this game. I think Willer was phenomenal. I think Closer was phenomenal. Envy and Kale are really good as a duo, but for me, Bertle absolutely deserved player of the series here, and I'm happy to give it to him. I think Willer and Closer have very sneakily become one of the better jungle mid duos in the entire league, perhaps even better than Canyon and Showmaker, who are just not on the same page right now, which we will get into, but Willer was phenomenal. 2 more facilitating games. Again, he's maybe the best facilitating jungler in the whole league. Peanut obviously argues with that, but still, Willer's right up there with him. He just plays that style super well. He's willing to give up basically infinite resources in order to make sure that his laners get ahead, most notably Closer, who he's willing to invest a ton into. Closer gets to pull out a couple more melee mids, because that's his specialty. That's what he likes to do, and he plays them at a super high level. The Yone in particular in game number 2 was super fun to watch, and Closer's really proving me wrong, I would say, as a player. Obviously, he still has his shortcomings. He's still not exactly the best on champions that aren't in his wheelhouse, but there's enough champions that are in his wheelhouse that it honestly doesn't matter. And obviously, Liiv SANDBOX has a lot of other, players on the team that you need to worry about other than Closer. You can't just ban him out every single game. So for the shortcomings that Closer has, he makes use of his advantages at an incredibly high level. And then Envy and Kale look great. I mean, Kale just might be the second best support in the LCK right now. Kellen was right there for me, but Kale was just straight up better in laning phase in both of these games. Obviously, Annie and a Tahm Kench, pretty difficult to do something there, but Kellen on the Kalista should have done a lot of damage into the Heimerdinger, should have been pretty impactful, but Envy and Kale were just better in the lane 2v2, which is super impressive on the side of SANDBOX. Hopefully they're able to keep that up. Obviously, Envy, I'm not going to say that he's just made better because of Kale, because credit to Envy, he stepped up a lot. He was really bad last year when he was subbed in, even playing with Kale in the support position, but to see him come back in here and play at such a high level against such a really good bot lane like Deft and Kellen, it just shows you how much he has grown as a player and how much he has evolved as a player over the past year or so. This Sandbox team is just kind of clicking on all cylinders, and I just hope they can keep it up because they're so fun to watch right now. And then for Dplus KIA, disaster strikes. I mean, I don't really know what to tell you. It really does feel like, and I hate to just boil your problems down to one thing, but if Deft and Kellen do not win bot lane, if they do not carry the game, generate this large lead, DK has no idea where to play through in the mid game. Like, they just don't have any idea where to go on the map. Canyon, honestly, has not been that good this year. He's going to get my dud of the series. That Elise game in game 2 was disaster. Completely out-jungled by Willer on the Maokai. He got zero pressure in early game. That's one of those champions where you're like, oh, just put Canyon on it. He'll be able to make something work. It was bad, and it's not just him. Showmaker has also been bad. I know I talked about him earlier in the week saying, like, yeah, he's getting better. Obviously, he had a good series earlier in the week. But for the most part this season, Showmaker has been a hindrance for DK, and that carried over into this series where he wasn't very good. Add on to that I think Kana, up on the top side, just exerts basically no pressure as long as he's, in a matchup where he's facing somebody who actually can play aggressive carries and wants to try to trade with him early. This top side for DK is genuinely concerning right now. I'm not exactly sure what that means for their long-term prospects, because you would hope that Canyon and Showmaker would be able to get back onto the right track like they have in the past, but right now it's just not clicking. Something is not clicking between those two players, and until it does, DK is going to continue to struggle. As for the rest of the team, Deft and Kellen are fine, but they didn't win lane in either of these games against Envy and Kale, who, while they really have been performing way above expectations, Deft and Kellen should be better, and they weren't better in this series. So DK honestly really struggling. I'm not hitting the full panic button. I'm not saying that they are a disaster just yet, but this team is certainly not where I think me and a lot of other people thought they were going to be after how, the LCK season started. It very much felt like T1 and DK at the top. That is not the case. DK might not even be a top 4 team in the LCK right now. It really is starting to be concerning. This jungle mid has to start stepping up, and top lane has to start being anything but a complete and utter neutral factor, because Deft and Kellen can only do so much. When they don't win like this, this team just feels utterly doomed, and that's not a good sign. As for Sandbox, though, huge win. You're sitting at 7-3 through your first 10 series. That's a phenomenal record. This team is genuinely legit. Bertle, Willer, Envy, Closer, Kale, all playing at a really high level right now. They are all more than the sum of their parts, and that is a great thing to see. This Sandbox organization seems to always outperform expectations, and this year seems to be no different. You're really just hoping that they can hang on, because there's not really a lot of parity at the top of the LCK standings, and Sandbox kind of makes it a lot more interesting to watch, in my opinion. Alright, that is going to do it for my LCK Week 5 overview and analysis of all 10 series across all 5 days. Up on your screen now, you're going to see the updated LCK standings. Of course, in the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. We can go over the risers and the fallers, but not a lot of changes this week. It's kind of funny. You'll notice on the power rankings, it is legitimately 1 to 10 in terms of standings, and I know that's a pretty crazy thing to see, considering I'm the person that comes out and says, I don't like doing power rankings based on standings, based on how teams are performing. However, it is pretty funny that my projections so far this year have kind of just all come true. Like, a lot of the things that I've said, a lot of the teams that I've kind of hitched my wagon to, a lot of the teams that I've been out on, it all just seems to kind of be coming into fruition. The only updates I have are KT and Sandbox jumping over Dplus KIA, who falls down to number 5. At this point, they feel significantly less secure than either of the two teams above them. KT jumping into the top 3, Sandbox jumping into the top 4 is really good. Han was right on their heels as well for me, but overall, honestly, like, I know that it's kind of crazy for me to go 1 to 10. I know it's a little bit boring, but I've been saying, like, these aren't a lot of changes. These teams weren't always in this order, but these are pretty much always how I've ranked them. It just feels like the LCK has been spot on in terms of my analysis and predictions, and so I don't really have to make any changes in terms of the power rankings, because look at the standings, everything is exactly how I thought it would be. So not a lot of adjustments there. But as for player of the week and dud of the week, my player of the week in Week 5, no surprise to a lot of people, is going to go to BDD on KT Rolster, who's just having an MVP caliber season. Some really good stuff coming out from him on a variety of champions. On his Classic Azir, on some Sylas, on some Akali. He can basically play everything at a high level now, unlike what he was able to do last year, and it's super encouraging if he's able to play at that level. If aiming continues to play at that level, obviously Cuz is doing well. Pretty much everybody, Keen's doing well on KT, everybody's doing well on KT. Lehens, I can't believe I failed to mention him. This team is going to be legit. There's a reason they jumped into my top 3, and they're on a 5-game win streak, but BDD definitely the standout for me in week number 5. And then my dud of the week is actually going to go to Croco on DRX, and that makes it a clean 3 weeks in a row that I've now given dud of the week to somebody on DRX. Week 3, it was Beryl. Week 4, it was Rascal. Week 5, it is now Croco. He gets benched for Juhan. He deserved it. He was garbage this week. Awful in that game number 1 in their second series, but even worse in their previous series. He just isn't very good. The entirety of DRX is just not good right now, and definitely Croco falls into that. So Croco is going to get my dud of the series, or my dud of the week, I should say, and BDD is going to get my player of the week for week number 5, but that's going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below who's too high, who's too low. You guys know the jazz by now. You guys probably disagree with somebody in my power rankings, but just let me know what that is. Of course, be respectful down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, if you made it all the way to the end here, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot for the channel, and it lets me know you guys are enjoying the LCK content. Of course, if you are new, hit that subscribe button. Not only do we do LCK weekly reviews, we do it for all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL. So if you're interested in that content, hit that subscribe button so you can get weekly reviews of all of those regions. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.